here we are. This is Sex Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat. Bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more.
You bring up this point where, because you just introduced two terms that I want to bring to our audience too. There is, when people initially hear the word sex worker, where do they usually go with that? What are they thinking they're talking about?
I think for the most part, people think of full service sex work. So they're thinking of what in a criminal legal context is called prostitution.
Yeah.
And Carol Lee coined the term sex work in the late 1970s and 80s to really put focus on the labor and the labor rights issue of sex work and the labor rights needs of people in the sex trade.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people in the trade appreciate using sex work or erotic labor for that, but also to really encompass what is a really broad industry. And so full service sex work is on one end of the spectrum. But we also see things that are more regulated, like stripping or camming or DIY porn, like OnlyFans.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those need a greater degree of, or require a greater degree of access and resources to be able to really enter those. And then on the other end, we see more of the unregulated things, the things that exist in the underground economy that both are less high barrier, but also way more risky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, I think that's important to define like the spectrum of it, because it also shows us how much of that, is socially, quote unquote, acceptable versus things that were like, oh, that's bad, or, like that's dirty, or that's, there's such an interesting, conditioning that we have towards the word, what comes up with it when we say it versus what we include in that word. I have so many friends who are now becoming dominatrixes because of my colleague, Colette Purvette, especially is teaching around a lot of dominatrixes. But then like you hear that and there's less of a stigma than say somebody who is working in a massage parlor, or somebody who's a tantrika is supposed to be hierarchy better than somebody who's not.
Yeah, I mean, on some degree too. I mean, I thought we can go deeper, Kat. The ocean is quite deep because it's all pretty racialized, honestly. And so when I say sex worker, especially if I say prostitute, that usually is a pretty racialized image. And in the reverse, if you want an exercise in racism, Google pimp. Because really what we mean there is third-party manager, but strip club owners, the guy who owns OnlyFans, are incredibly exploited. but like those are all white guys who are making money off of overwhelmingly women's bodies, whereas basically in the underground economy, we then call that a pimp or now a trafficker. Right. And so, but if you think of a dominatrix, most people are generally thinking of a white woman. And so I think those things tend to be in massage parlor, generally an Asian woman. And so these things tend to be really racialized. And I think that that also kind of plays into some of this conversation.
Yeah. So really inviting us all to sit with the definitions. How are we defining things? What are our attitudes towards these? Like deconstructing what we understand to be sex work, or what we understand to be surrounding that. When you then take the word sex work and you put it next to sex trafficking, as you were saying, these two terms can often be conflated or, interchanged. How would you help people to understand the difference between those? Because that's important.
Absolutely. So one of the main tools that I found really helpful, and this actually is in our book, Body Autonomy, Decolonizing Sex Work and Drug Use, and the first chapter, Mechanics of the Sex Trade. It's called the 3 C's model, or choice, circumstance, and coercion. And so a lot of times in this idea that sex work leads to sex trafficking, or there's a murky, maybe gray area between, it's really taking that idea of choice and circumstance out of the equation. And so a choice-based sex worker is someone who is fully consenting to do it. Generally someone who has the ability to get another job if they want, maybe, has an ID, has access to internet, and chooses to do sex work for a variety of reasons. Maybe the hours fit their life. A lot of times sex workers are caretakers to, youngins or elders, and the hours work, a variety of different reasons there. And then a circumstantial sex worker is someone who is still consenting to the work, but wouldn't be doing the work if their circumstances were different. And so we see a lot of times people are doing sex work, like stripping, et cetera, to get themselves through school and have to pay off their student debts. I've seen just a rising number of different articles that are talking about people needing to do sex to get through school, right? That's circumstantial. A lot of the street-based sex workers who I've worked with said that, if they weren't drug dependent, if they weren't in an abusive situation, if things were different, if they had a house, if, all the way to Z in terms of reasons, that they would rather not be doing this. They're doing it just because of the moment. And so it's important to recognize someone's choice in that. And again, we really need to look at the resources and how to support people in getting to the goal that they describe for themselves. And then coercion is actually way bigger than trafficking. Trafficking is a very kind of narrow definition of exploitation, but coercion more generally in the sex trade is someone being tricked or forced to do something they don't want to do. So that can be situationally, or that can be kind of an ongoing circumstance or situation for someone. And it's important to recognize, just like I think it's what the Zimberg model of drug setting, that the 3Cs model is also kind of a continuum of someone's mindset. So we like to call it sex work setting, right? So how someone's approaching their work. And someone could very much start the day as being a choice-based sex worker and say, like, I absolutely really love this, and then have a bad encounter and be like, okay, actually, I want to start looking for something different to do. Or in studies I've done of street-based sex workers, 50% of my samples, their first experience in the sex trade was one of force, fraud, or coercion, but they've come back independently to work in the trade and now consider themselves to be either circumstantial or choice-based sex workers. And so being able to understand that that's kind of a continuum is really helpful.
It is, and it creates more of a space of humanity, the dynamic nature of us as humans. It's not so black and white as we so neatly like to organize things, but to really get into the nuance and the curiosity and compassion level, so that we can actually help and get the help that we need. Because as a therapist, I believe that there's space for me as a sex therapist who educates and can do, more of this talk stuff and, workshops and everything. But there's a line for me. And that's where a sex worker can come in and do the work that I can't do. And I won't do for my clients for a good reason of, there's space for us all. I've referred to clients to sex surrogates in California. It's legal. And that's another whole issue there too, the word legal, of creating, it's okay, quote unquote, because it's legal, or, but even just like referring clients to dominatrixes or tantric practitioners to be able to support where I wouldn't be able to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm no longer a sex worker, but when I was, and same with, I have many friends who are still doing sex work. And when I was doing sex work, same with my friends who still are, there have been times where people have said, well, actually my therapist said that I should start coming and seeing someone. And I just thought that's so amazing, right? That someone does, one, recognize the legitimacy of sex workers, and two, recognize that, look, we can't be all things to someone, and we're really here to support someone's healing and whatever they're defining for themselves, and that there are people out there who are doing that. So I thank you for that. That's
awesome. Yeah, there's space for us all.
Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex Love Psychedelics.